Teacher scolds quiet black girl for missing class, stunned when she reveals her abusive father got her pregnant. The fluorescent lights of Northwood High hummed a monotonous tune, a constant backdrop to Mrs. Eleanor Harris's 11th grade American literature class. Eleanor, or Mrs. Harris, as she was universally known, adjusted her glasses and scanned the room. It was a Tuesday, and as had become frustratingly common, Keisha Jones's seat was empty. Eleanor sighed, a small, almost imperceptible sound. It wasn't the empty desk itself that bothered her. Classrooms had empty desks. It was the pattern of Keisha's absences. 2, sometimes 3 days a week, Keisha simply wasn't there. And when she was present, she was a shadow, a ghost in the back row, barely participating, her eyes downcast, her voice a whisper. Northwood High, nestled in a quiet, working-class suburb of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, wasn't a bad school. It had its share of challenges like any public school in America, but it was generally safe, and most of the students were, if not academically brilliant, at least reasonably engaged. Keisha Jones was an anomaly. Eleanor had been teaching for over 30 years. She'd seen it all: the rebellious teenagers, the struggling learners, the heartbroken, the lost. She prided herself on her ability to connect with her students, to see beyond the surface and understand the underlying currents that shaped their behavior. But Keisha was a locked box, a puzzle she couldn't solve. "All right, class," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a gentle authority honed over decades. "Let's turn to page 142 in The Great Gatsby. We're going to discuss the symbolism of the green light today." The class rustled with the sound of turning pages. Eleanor began to lead the discussion, drawing out interpretations from her students, prompting them to think critically about Fitzgerald's masterpiece. But her mind kept drifting back to Keisha. It wasn't just the academic consequences of missing so much school. It was a deeper concern, a gnawing feeling that something was profoundly wrong. Keisha had started the year like any other student. She'd been quiet, certainly, but not alarmingly so. She'd completed her assignments, albeit with a minimalist effort. Her grades were average, hovering around a C+. But then, sometime in October, the absences had begun. At first, they were sporadic, a day here, a day there. But by November, they had become a regular occurrence. Eleanor had tried the usual approaches. She'd marked Keisha absent, of course. She'd assigned detentions for missed classes, detentions that Keisha predictably didn't attend. She'd sent notes home, standard issue forms generated by the school's automated system. She'd even tried calling the number listed as Keisha's home phone, but it always went straight to voicemail, a generic message that gave no indication of who the recipient was. The school counselor, Mr. Davies, a kind but overworked man in his 50s, had also attempted to reach out to Keisha's family. He'd had no more success than Eleanor. "It's like she's fallen off the grid, Mrs. Harris," he'd said, shaking his head wearily. "We have no emergency contact, no other family members listed. It's just that one phone number, and it's a dead end." Eleanor looked at Keisha's empty desk again. The smooth, polished wood seemed to reflect the emptiness she felt in her gut. She knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that Keisha Jones was in trouble. The question was, what kind of trouble, and how could she help? The bell rang, signaling the end of the period. Students gathered their books and shuffled out of the classroom, their chatter filling the void. Eleanor remained at her desk, staring at the empty space where Keisha should have been. She made a decision. She would try again, one more time, to reach Keisha. But this time, she wouldn't rely on form letters and unanswered phone calls. She would try to find her, to talk to her, to understand. The next day, Keisha was in class. It was a small victory, Eleanor thought, but a victory nonetheless. Keisha sat in her usual spot, in the back row, her head bent over her notebook. She was wearing a large, oversized hoodie, the hood pulled up, obscuring most of her face. Eleanor tried to catch her eye during the lesson, but Keisha seemed determined to avoid any contact. She didn't raise her hand, didn't speak, didn't even look up when Eleanor called on other students. It was as if she were trying to make herself invisible. During a brief independent work period, Eleanor quietly walked to the back of the room and knelt beside Keisha's desk. "Keisha," she said softly, "can I talk to you for a moment after class?" Keisha flinched, her body tensing. She didn't look up, but she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. When the bell rang, the other students filed out, leaving Eleanor and Keisha alone in the classroom. The silence was thick, heavy with unspoken words. "Keisha," Eleanor began, her voice gentle, "I'm worried about you. You've been missing a lot of school, and when you are here, you seem distant." Keisha remained silent, her head still bowed. Eleanor could see the faint tremor in her hands. "I know things can be tough," Eleanor continued, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes there are things going on at home or in our personal lives that make it hard to focus on school. If there's anything you want to talk about, anything I can help you with, please know that you can come to me. I'm here to listen." Keisha slowly lifted her head, and for the first time, Eleanor saw her face clearly. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, as if she'd been crying. There was a faint bruise on her cheek, barely visible beneath a layer of makeup. Eleanor's heart clenched. The bruise was a new development, a physical manifestation of the unease she'd been feeling for weeks. "Keisha," Eleanor said, her voice softer still, "what's happened?" Keisha looked away, her gaze fixed on the empty desks in front of her. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. She seemed to be struggling with some internal battle. Finally, she whispered, "Can't." "You can't what?" Eleanor prompted gently. "Can't talk about it? Can't come to school?" Keisha shook her head. "Just can't." Eleanor reached out and gently touched Keisha's arm. The girl flinched again, but this time she didn't pull away. "Keisha," Eleanor said, her voice firm but compassionate, "whatever it is, you don't have to go through it alone. There are people who can help you. I can help you." Keisha looked at Eleanor, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. For a moment, it seemed as if she might break down, might finally confide in her teacher. But then, the moment passed. She shook her head again, her expression hardening. "I have to go," she mumbled, gathering her books and quickly leaving the classroom. Eleanor watched her go, feeling a profound sense of frustration and helplessness. She had really tried to reach Keisha, but the wall around the girl was too high, too strong. That evening, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, grading papers. But her mind wasn't on the essays in front of her. She was thinking about Keisha, about the bruise on her cheek, about the fear in her eyes. She picked up her phone and dialed Mr. Davies' number. "David," she said, "I'm really worried about Keisha Jones. I had a brief conversation with her today, and he thinks something serious is going on. I saw a bruise on her face, and she seemed terrified." Mr. Davies sighed. "I know, Eleanor. I've been trying to get through to her family for weeks. No luck. The phone number is a dead end, and we have no other contact information. We need to do something," Eleanor insisted. "We can't just let this go. What about contacting Child Protective Services? Shouldn't we report this?" "We could, Mr. Davies said, his voice hesitant. "But we need more than just a suspicion, Eleanor. We need some kind of concrete evidence of abuse or neglect. A bruise, even combined with absenteeism, isn't enough. They'll likely just tell us to keep monitoring the situation." Eleanor knew he was right. The system was designed to protect children, but it was also burdened by bureaucracy and a heavy caseload. Without clear evidence, a report might not lead to any immediate action. "I just have a feeling, David," Eleanor said, her voice filled with a sense of urgency. "A feeling that we're running out of time." The following week was a blur of classes, grading, and faculty meetings. Eleanor kept a close eye on Keisha, but the girl remained withdrawn and elusive. She attended school sporadically, her absences punctuated by brief appearances in which she seemed even more fragile than before. The glimmer of truth, as Eleanor later came to think of it, came on a Thursday afternoon. Eleanor was teaching a lesson on Emily Dickinson's poetry, focusing on the themes of isolation and despair. She'd chosen the poems deliberately, hoping to create an opening for Keisha, a way for her to connect with the material and perhaps, indirectly, with her own feelings. As Eleanor read Dickinson's poem, I felt a funeral in my brain. She noticed Keisha staring intently at her textbook. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a spark of recognition, perhaps, or a hint of shared pain. After reading the poem aloud, Eleanor asked the class, "What do you think Dickinson is trying to convey in this poem? What kind of emotions is she describing?" Several students raised their hands, offering interpretations of the poem's imagery and symbolism. Keisha remained silent, her gaze fixed on her desk. Eleanor decided to take a chance. "Keisha," she said gently, "what do you think? Does this poem resonate with you in any way?" Keisha flinched, as if startled by the direct question. She looked up, her eyes wide and uncertain. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of speaking, but then she shook her head and mumbled, "I don't know." Eleanor didn't press her. She knew that forcing Keisha to talk wouldn't work. But she noticed something else, a small, almost imperceptible movement of Keisha's hand. She was clutching a crumpled piece of paper, her knuckles white with tension. After class, as the students were packing up their belongings, Eleanor approached Keisha's desk. "Keisha," she said quietly, "can I see you for a moment?" Keisha hesitated, then nodded slowly. She remained seated, her eyes downcast. Eleanor knelt beside her, her voice low and confidential. "Keisha," she said, "I saw you holding that piece of paper during class. Is there something you want to tell me? Something you've written down, perhaps?" Keisha's grip on the paper tightened. She didn't speak, but a single tear rolled down her cheek. Eleanor waited patiently, her hand resting gently on Keisha's arm. She didn't push, didn't pry. She simply offered her presence, her support, her unwavering attention. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Keisha slowly unfolded the crumpled paper. It was a poem, written in a shaky, uneven hand. It wasn't a polished piece of work, but it was raw, honest, and deeply disturbing. The poem described a world of darkness and fear, of constant threat and violation. It spoke of a monster who lurked in the shadows, a figure who stole innocence and inflicted pain. It was a cry for help, a desperate plea hidden within the lines of verse. Eleanor read the poem slowly, her heart aching with each word. It was clear, even without explicit details, that Keisha was describing a situation of abuse. The monster was not a fictional creature. It was someone real, someone close to her. When she finished reading, Eleanor looked at Keisha, her eyes filled with compassion. "Keisha," she said softly, this is very powerful, and very brave of you to share it with me." Keisha didn't speak. She was trembling, her body racked with silent sobs. "Keisha," Eleanor continued, her voice firm but gentle, "I believe you, and I want you to know that you're not alone. We're going to get you help." It was the glimmer of truth, the crack in the wall that Keisha had built around herself. It wasn't a full confession, not yet, but it was enough. It was a starting point. Eleanor took Keisha to the school counselor's office immediately. Mr. Davies, after reading the poem, shared Eleanor's alarm. He ushered Keisha into his private office, a small, comfortable space with soft lighting and a box of tissues on the desk. Eleanor stayed with her, sitting beside her on a small couch, offering a reassuring presence. Mr. Davies sat across from them, his expression grave but compassionate. "Keisha," he said gently, "Mrs. Harris showed me the poem you wrote. It's very moving, and it tells us that you're hurting very badly." Keisha nodded, her eyes still downcast. She was clutching the poem in her lap, her fingers twisting the paper. "Can you tell us, Keisha," Mr. Davies continued, "who the monster is in your poem?" Keisha hesitated. She looked at Eleanor, then back at Mr. Davies. The fear in her eyes was palpable. "It's okay, Keisha," Eleanor said softly, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "You're safe here. We're here to help you." Keisha took a deep breath, her chest heaving. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "It's my father." The words hung in the air, heavy and stark. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had suspected abuse, but hearing the words spoken aloud, hearing Keisha identify her own father as the perpetrator, was a different level of horror. "Mr. Davies remained calm, his voice steady. Can you tell us more, Keisha? What has your father been doing to you?" Keisha began to cry, softly at first, then with increasing intensity. The words came haltingly, interspersed with sobs and gasps for air. She described years of abuse, starting when she was a small child. She spoke of physical violence, of being hit and slapped and punched. She spoke of sexual abuse, of being molested and forced to endure unspeakable acts. Eleanor listened in stunned silence, her heart breaking for the young girl sitting beside her. She held Keisha's hand, offering what little comfort she could. The details were horrific, but Eleanor knew that Keisha needed to tell her story, to unburden herself of the secret she had carried for so long. Mr. Davies, trained in handling such disclosures, asked questions carefully, guiding Keisha through her narrative without pushing her too hard. He documented everything she said, meticulously recording the details of the abuse. As Keisha spoke, Eleanor noticed a change in her demeanor. The fear was still there, of course, but there was also a sense of relief, however fragile, beginning to emerge. The act of speaking, of finally giving voice to her pain, seemed to be lifting a tremendous weight from her shoulders. The confession lasted for over an hour. By the time Keisha finished, she was emotionally and physically exhausted. She leaned against Eleanor, her body trembling, her tears soaking into Eleanor's blouse. Mr. Davies, his face pale but resolute, closed his notebook. "Keisha," he said, "thank you for telling us this. You are incredibly brave, and I want you to know that we believe you, and we're going to do everything we can to protect you." He explained the next steps. He was legally obligated, as a mandated reporter, to report the abuse to Child Protective Services, CPS, and the police. He assured Keisha that this was not her fault, that she had done nothing wrong, and that the purpose of reporting was to ensure her safety. Keisha nodded weakly. She seemed to understand, but the fear in her eyes was still evident. She was afraid of what her father might do, afraid of the unknown future that lay ahead. "Will Hughie find out I told?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "We will do everything we can to keep you safe, Mr. Davies reassured her. "CPS will investigate, and they may need to remove you from your home to ensure your protection." The word remove hit Keisha hard. She recoiled slightly, her grip on Eleanor's hand tightening. The thought of leaving her home, even a home filled with abuse, was terrifying. It was the only life she had ever known. Eleanor squeezed Keisha's hand. "It's going to be okay, Keisha," she said, her voice filled with a conviction she wasn't entirely sure she felt. "It's going to be hard, but you're not alone. We'll be here for you." Mr. Davies made the necessary calls. He contacted CPS, speaking to an intake worker and relaying the details of Keisha's disclosure. He also called the local police department, reporting the suspected child abuse. He explained that Keisha was currently at the school and that she needed immediate protection. While they waited for CPS and the police to arrive, Eleanor stayed with Keisha. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound Keisha's occasional sniffles. Eleanor offered her tissues, a comforting touch, and the silent reassurance of her presence. She thought about the years of suffering Keisha had endured, the courage it had taken for her to finally speak out. She thought about the failures of the system, the missed opportunities to intervene. She had suspected something was wrong, but she hadn't known the extent of the horror. She also thought about her own role, her own responsibility. She was a teacher, not a social worker or a therapist, but she was an adult, a person in a position of authority, and she had a duty to protect the children in her care. She resolved to be more vigilant, more proactive in the future. She would never again ignore the signs, the subtle clues that might indicate a child was in danger. The arrival of the CPS worker and a police officer marked a shift in the atmosphere. The quiet, contained space of the counselor's office was suddenly filled with the presence of authority, of official procedures, of the stark reality of the situation. The CPS worker, a woman named Ms. Ramirez, was professional and compassionate. She introduced herself to Keisha and explained her role. She would be conducting an investigation into the allegations of abuse and would be responsible for determining Keisha's immediate safety. The police officer, Officer Miller, was more formal, but he also treated Keisha with respect. He explained that he needed to ask her some questions about the abuse, but that he would try to make it as brief and painless as possible. Keisha was understandably apprehensive. She looked to Eleanor for reassurance, her eyes wide with fear. Eleanor squeezed her hand and gave her an encouraging nod. "You can do this, Keisha," she whispered. "Just tell them the truth." Ms. Ramirez and Officer Miller interviewed Keisha separately. Ms. Ramirez focused on Keisha's overall well-being, her living situation, and her immediate needs. Officer Miller focused on the specific details of the abuse, gathering evidence for a potential criminal case against Keisha's father. Eleanor waited outside the office during the interviews, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. She paced the hallway, replaying Keisha's confession in her mind, the images of the abuse vivid and disturbing. After what seemed like an eternity, Ms. Ramirez and Officer Miller emerged from the office. Ms. Ramirez approached Eleanor. "Mrs. Harris," she said, "we've completed our initial interviews. Based on Keisha's statements and the evidence we've gathered, we have determined that she is in imminent danger. We will be taking her into protective custody." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She had expected this outcome, but hearing the words spoken aloud was still a blow. "Where will she go?" Eleanor asked. "We'll be placing her in emergency foster care," Ms. Ramirez explained. "We have a network of licensed foster families who are trained to care for children who have experienced trauma. We'll find a safe and supportive home for her." Can I see her before she goes?" Eleanor asked. Ms. Ramirez nodded. "Of course. She's in the office with Officer Miller. He's just finishing up his report." Eleanor went back into the office. Keisha was sitting on the couch, her eyes red and swollen. She looked small and vulnerable, a child caught in a nightmare. Eleanor knelt beside her. "Keisha," she said softly, "they're going to take you to a safe place now. A place where you'll be protected." Keisha nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want to go," she whispered. "I know," Eleanor said, her voice choked with emotion. "I know it's scary, but it's the best thing for you right now. You need to be safe." She hugged Keisha tightly, holding her close for a long moment. "You are so brave, Keisha," she said. "You did the right thing, and I'm so proud of you." Keisha clung to Eleanor, her body shaking with sobs. "Well, will I ever see you again?" she asked. "Of course," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "I promise. I'll stay in touch. I'll visit you. I'll be here for you, however I can." She held Keisha until Ms. Ramirez gently intervened. "It's time to go, Keisha," she said softly. Keisha reluctantly let go of Eleanor. She looked at her teacher one last time, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. Then, she turned and walked out of the office with Ms. Ramirez and Officer Miller, leaving Eleanor standing alone, her heart aching with a mixture of sadness, relief, and a profound sense of responsibility. The days and weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The police investigation into Keisha's father, Robert Jones, proceeded swiftly. He was arrested and charged with multiple counts of child abuse and sexual assault. He denied the allegations, claiming that Keisha was lying, that she was a troubled and rebellious teenager who was making up stories to get attention. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Keisha's testimony, corroborated by the poem she had written and the medical examination conducted by CPS, painted a clear picture of years of horrific abuse. The physical evidence, though limited due to the passage of time, further supported Keisha's claims. Keisha, meanwhile, was placed in the care of a foster family, the Millers, no relation to the officer, a kind and compassionate couple who lived in a quiet suburb a few towns away from Northwood. They had experience fostering children who had experienced trauma, and they provided Keisha with a safe, stable, and nurturing environment. The transition to foster care was difficult for Keisha. She missed Eleanor. She missed her school, even though it had been a source of anxiety. And she missed the familiarity of her old life, however terrible it had been. She struggled with nightmares, flashbacks, and intense feelings of fear, anger, and sadness. She began therapy with a therapist specializing in child trauma, Dr. Lawson. The therapy sessions were painful, forcing Keisha to confront the horrors she had endured. But they were also essential to her healing process. Dr. Lawson helped Keisha to understand that she was not to blame for the abuse, that she was a survivor, not a victim, and that she had the strength to overcome her trauma. Eleanor kept her promise to Keisha. She visited her regularly at the Miller's home, bringing her books, small gifts, and news from school. She became a constant presence in Keisha's life, a source of support and encouragement. She also testified at Robert Jones's trial. Robert's trial was a grueling ordeal. Keisha had to testify, reliving the abuse in graphic detail in front of a courtroom full of strangers. Eleanor sat in the gallery, offering silent support, her heart aching for the young girl on the witness stand. The defense attorney tried to discredit Keisha, portraying her as a troubled and unreliable witness. He questioned her motives, suggesting that she had fabricated the allegations to get revenge on her father. But Keisha held her ground. She answered the questions honestly and directly, her voice trembling but firm. Her testimony was powerful and convincing. In the end, the jury found Robert Jones guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, a sentence that brought a measure of justice to Keisha but could never fully erase the scars of his abuse. The fallout from the case extended beyond the courtroom. The local community was shocked and outraged by the revelations of the abuse. There were calls for greater awareness of child abuse and for improved reporting mechanisms. Northwood High School implemented new training programs for teachers and staff, focusing on identifying and responding to suspected cases of abuse. For Eleanor, the experience was transformative. She became an advocate for child protection, speaking at community events and working with local organizations to raise awareness of the issue. She also continued to mentor Keisha, supporting her through her journey of healing and recovery. Years passed. Keisha remained in foster care with the Millers, who eventually became her legal guardians. She thrived in their care, slowly but surely healing from the trauma of her past. She finished high school, graduating with honors, a testament to her resilience and determination. The therapy continued, helping her to process her experiences, develop coping mechanisms, and build a sense of self-worth. She learned to trust again, to form healthy relationships, and to believe in the possibility of a brighter future. Eleanor remained a constant presence in her life. Their relationship evolved from teacher-student to mentor-mentee and, eventually, to a deep and lasting friendship. Eleanor watched with pride as Keisha blossomed into a confident and capable young woman. Keisha decided to pursue a degree in social work. She wanted to help other children who had experienced abuse, to give them the support and advocacy that she had received. She was driven by a deep sense of empathy and a desire to make a difference in the world. The road to healing was long and arduous. There were setbacks, moments of despair, and lingering emotional scars. But Keisha never gave up. She drew strength from her own resilience, from the support of her foster family and Eleanor, and from her determination to create a better life for herself and for others. One sunny afternoon, several years after the trial, Keisha and Eleanor met for lunch at a small cafe near the university where Keisha was studying. They sat at an outdoor table, enjoying the warm sunshine and the easy conversation that flowed between them. "I never thought I'd be here, Mrs. Harris," Keisha said, a smile playing on her lips. "At college, studying social work, feeling happy." Eleanor smiled back. "I always knew you could do it, Keisha. You're one of the strongest people I know." Keisha looked down at her hands, a thoughtful expression on her face. "It's still hard sometimes," she admitted. The memories, they don't just go away, but they don't control me anymore. That's the key, Keisha, Eleanor said. Healing isn't about forgetting. It's about learning to live with the past, without letting it define your future. Keisha nodded. Dr. Lawson says the same thing. She says I'm a survivor, not a victim. She's right, Eleanor said. And you're an inspiration, Keisha, to me, and to so many others. Keisha blushed, a hint of her old shyness returning. I just want to help other kids, she said. I want to make sure that no one has to go through what I went through. Eleanor reached across the table and took Keisha's hand. You will, Keisha, she said, her voice filled with emotion. You already are. The story ends not with a perfect resolution, because trauma leaves lasting marks. But it ends with hope. Keisha's life, once defined by darkness and abuse, is now filled with light and possibility. She has found her voice, her strength, and her purpose. And she has learned that even in the face of unimaginable pain, healing is possible, and a future filled with love, hope, and purpose can be built one step at a time. The support of one caring adult, one teacher who refused to look away, played a crucial role in that transformation. And that, in itself, is a powerful message of hope.